The doctor accompanying a death observes the moment when vital functions cease. The heart stops, breathing stops, brain waves flatten. For medicine, this is the event. What happened before and after that moment is physiology and biochemistry, processes that science knows how to describe with increasing precision. For Rudolf Steiner, this instant that medicine designated as death was the point at which the most significant process in the entire life of the being who had died was just beginning. What medicine saw was the end of a phase. What spiritual investigation revealed was the opening of another phase, of a breadth and nature that completely transcended what the closed phase had provided. And the difference between these two perspectives was not simply the difference between faith and skepticism, between religious solace and scientific sobriety. It was the difference between two types of investigation that observed the same event with completely different instruments, and therefore arrived at completely different descriptions of what had happened. The spiritual inquiry that Steiner had developed over decades was neither philosophical speculation nor doctrinal faith. It was the application to the spiritual domain of the same principles of rigor, verifiability, and openness to evidence that made natural science reliable in its domains. The instruments were different because the object was different. Where natural science used apparatus and measurements, spiritual science used faculties of inner perception that could be developed by any human being who underwent the appropriate training process, just as anyone with a musical ear could develop the ability to distinguish tones that most people heard as undifferentiated. What these faculties revealed about the process of death was of a specificity and consistency that made it possible to describe it with a precision that the purely material perspective had not achieved. The theme that Steiner had called the passage of a human being through the portal of death as a transformation of life contained in the choice of each word, a density of meaning that was worth unfolding before going into what the investigation had revealed about the process itself. The word passage indicated movement, not cessation, not extinction, but crossing from one point to another, from one state to another state. The portal indicated that there were two sides, that what passed through continued to exist on the other side, and that the portal was the opening between two distinct domains. Death, therefore, not as an end, but as a portal. And most surprising of all, the expression is a transformation of life, not a transformation of the being that dies, not a transformation of consciousness, not a transformation of destiny, a transformation of life, as if life, the incarnated life that had been lived with all its events and its developments and its failures, was what passed through the transformed portal, what arrived on the other side in a different form but recognizable as what life had been. To understand what this expression precisely captured about what Steiner had investigated, it was necessary to enter into the perspective he had developed on the constitution of the human being, not as a physical body that produced consciousness, as an epiphenomenon of brain processes, but as a being of multiple dimensions that operated together during incarnation, and that separated in the process of death in specific ways that determined what happened next. The physical body was the densest dimension, the one that shared the laws that governed inorganic matter, and that after death progressively returned to the elements that had been its composition. The etheric body was the dimension of the vital forces, which had kept the physical body organized and alive, and which separated from the physical body in the process of death, remaining for a period before also dissolving into the universal etheric field. The astral body was the dimension of the forces of feeling and desire, the seat of the emotional life and aspirations that had colored the entire experience of incarnated life. And the self, the deepest spiritual core, was what carried the identity of the being throughout multiple incarnations, what had been present in all previous lives and would continue to be present in future incarnations as the point of continuity that crossed all transformations. The death that medicine designated as the moment in which the heart stopped was, in Steiner's perspective, the moment in which the self and the astral body separated from the physical body and the etheric body in a way that was not simply the separation that sleep accomplished each night, but a definitive separation for that incarnation. The etheric body, however, did not separate immediately. There was a period, of variable duration, but which corresponded approximately mind for 1 to 3 days, during which the etheric body still remained attached to the physical body, even after the physical body had ceased to function. And it was during this period that what Steiner described as the first and most important experience after death took place, the experience that the entire spiritual tradition had intuited but had rarely described with the precision that spiritual investigation made possible. It was during this phase of separation from the etheric body that the being experienced the retrospective panorama of his entire life. Not as memory that recalled specific events in the sequence in which they had happened, which was the form that memory took during incarnated life and which was necessarily limited by the subjective perspective of the ego that had experienced the events. It was a completely different way of seeing, simultaneous rather than sequential, comprehensive rather than fragmentary, and from a perspective that incarnated life had never provided. The being saw his own life as a whole, like a tapestry whose patterns were now visible for the first time because he had climbed high enough to see the whole that had been woven thread by thread throughout his life. But what made this vision spiritual, and not simply a review of memories, was something that Steiner's investigation had identified with a precision that most traditions had only intuited. The perspective from which the vision took place had completely changed. During life, the being had seen everything from within its own ego. It had felt its feelings, desired its desires, interpreted the world from the point of view of the ego that had always been the center of all its experience. In retrospect, this point of view had shifted in a way that completely transformed what was seen. The being now saw his life from the perspective of the effect he had produced on others. He saw what each act had created in the spiritual field of the beings with whom he had interacted, what each word had built or destroyed in the spiritual reality of the relationships he had maintained, what had been the true consequence of each choice that the habitual ego had made based on its own criteria of convenience and interest. This shift in perspective produced an experience that no ordinary language could fully describe, but which Steiner had approached with images that captured something of what was happening. The being who had caused suffering to others now experienced the suffering in the spiritual field itself, not as an externally imposed punishment, but as the natural consequence that the distance that had separated the habitual ego from the suffering it had caused had dissolved on the spiritual plane. The being who had provided genuine joy and real love now experienced that joy and love in the spiritual field itself in ways that enriched the experience of the panorama, with a quality that investigation described as extraordinarily vivid. It was as if the membrane that had separated the ego from its own consequences throughout incarnated life finally became transparent, and what had been on the other side of that membrane became as immediately present as anything that had been experienced during life. The duration of the retrospective panorama corresponded, in Steiner's description, to the period that the being had spent awake throughout his entire incarnated life. Since most human beings spent approximately 2/3 of their lives awake and 1/3 asleep, the panorama lasted approximately 2/3 of the total number of days in their lives. For a life of 70 years, this would correspond to a period of a few months during which the being remained in this state of panoramic vision before the etheric body completely separated from the group that continued its journey on the spiritual plane. What the perspective on the retrospective panorama revealed about incarnated life was something that completely transformed the way of seeing what was being done at each moment of existence. Every act, every word, every thought that produced effects in the spiritual field of other beings had to be seen by those who produced it in the retrospective panorama from the perspective of those effects. There was no act that did not have spiritual consequences. There was no word that did not change the spiritual field of those who heard it. There was no thought that did not create something on the spiritual plane, even if no external manifestation revealed it. And all this was to be found again in retrospect, from the perspective that had been absent during the incarnate life, the perspective of what had produced in others, rather than the perspective of what had produced in the habitual ego of what had accomplished it. After separation from the etheric body, it dissolved the retro-panorama pective. When it was completed, there was the state that Steiner called Kamaloka. It was the period in which the being, now carrying only the astral body and the self, encountered the contents of the astral body that had been developed throughout the incarnated life. The desires, the attachments, the passions, the aspirations, the emotional patterns that had constituted the inner life of the being in the dimension that transcended the purely intellectual. And what made this encounter different from anything that had happened during incarnated life was that the encounter now took place under the conditions of the spiritual plane, in which the forms of satisfaction that the physical plane had made available simply did not exist. The astral body, with all the intensity of its desires and attachments that it had developed during incarnated life, found itself on the spiritual plane in the same way that a thirsty being would find itself in a desert without water, with all the intensity of thirst, and without the possibility of quenching thirst through the usual means. Not because an external force prevented satisfaction, but because the conditions that made satisfaction possible were inseparable from the conditions on the physical plane that were no longer present. And the work of Kamaloka was precisely the work of finding and progressively working with these contents of the astral body in ways that freed the forces that had been trapped in the dependencies of physical objects and that became available as forces of genuine spiritual development when those dependencies had been sufficiently worked on. There was a precision in Steiner's description of the Kamaloka that was rarely found in the descriptions that traditions had produced of analogous states. It was not simply a generic state of purification that the being went through before reaching a higher plane of existence. It was a state with a specific structure that corresponded to the structure of the human astral body and the specific nature of the contents that had been developed in it during incarnated life. The being traveled through the Kamaloka in the opposite order to the order in which it had lived its incarnated life. It began with what had been most recent and worked progressively towards what had been oldest, in ways that corresponded to the order in which the different contents of the astral body had been deposited throughout life. The duration of Kamaloka corresponded, in Steiner's investigation, to approximately 1/3 of the duration of incarnated life. The period that had been spent in sleep during life, the period during which the being had been partially absent from the physical plane in ways that consciousness had not directly followed. It was as if the being was now living with full awareness what had passed unconsciously during the sleep of the incarnated life, finding with clarity that the incarnated life had not provided the contents that had operated during sleep without the daytime consciousness having direct access to them. What determined the intensity and quality of Kamaloka was, in Steiner's perspective, directly proportional to the intensity and quality of the forces of desire and attachment that had been developed during incarnated life. A being who had cultivated throughout his life a relationship with the physical world that was progressively less dominated by the desires of the habitual ego, who had learned to appreciate what the physical world provided without creating dependencies that transformed appreciation into a necessity, arrived at Kamaloka with a correspondingly lower intensity of content to work with. A being who had lived immersed in sensory satisfactions, without developing any dimension of his existence that transcended these satisfactions, arrived at Kamaloka with contents of a correspondingly greater intensity. But Steiner was careful to make clear that this difference was not a moral judgment about the value of one kind of life compared to another. It was simply the description of a spiritual law that operated with the same objectivity with which physical laws operated. In the same way that a muscle that had been exercised during incarnated life arrived at the end of life in a different state than a muscle that had been neglected, an astral body that had been worked spiritually throughout life arrived at Kamaloka in a different state than an astral body that had simply been indulged. Neither punishment nor reward. Consequence. The period after Kamaloka was what Steiner called Devachan, using a term he had encountered in Hindu tradition but had recharacterized through his own investigation. Devachan was the state in which the being, having worked with the contents of the astral body, and having progressively freed itself from the dependencies that linked it to the physical plane, entered a plane of existence that was qualitatively different from anything that had been seen before. Incarnated life had provided the plane in which the spiritual, which had been present during incarnated life as a deeper layer beneath physical experiences, now became the dominant element, and the physical the distant background. The experience of Devachan was determined by what had been developed during incarnated life in ways that went beyond what had been developed in the astral body. The spiritual that had been developed in the genuine thoughts, in the relationships that had reached the real being of the other, in the acts that had been performed from the best available understanding of what was truly necessary, all this became in Devachan the living material of an existence that was much richer and much freer than incarnated existence had allowed. The limitation that the physical body had imposed on consciousness, the forgetfulness that sleep regularly imposed, the partiality that the habitual ego's perspective had created toward what was real, all of this had disappeared, and what had been incarnated life now revealed itself in its spiritual content with a clarity and completeness that incarnated life itself had never provided. It was here that the expression, a transformation of life, gained its most precise meaning. The life that had been lived had not simply ended and given way to something else. It had been transformed. What had been lived as incarnate experience, with all its partiality and its fragmentation and its limitation from the perspective of the habitual ego, became in Devachan something that was both recognizable as the life that had been and radically different from it, because it was now seen and experienced from a perspective that revealed what had always been present beneath the experiences as their deepest spiritual dimension. The duration of Devachan was much longer than the duration of previous states and could extend for centuries from the point of view of physical time. But the relationship between the time of the spiritual plane and the time of the physical plane was of a nature that made the comparison only approximate. The being in Devachan did not experience time in the same way that the incarnated being experienced physical time, and what might seem very long from the perspective of physical time did not necessarily correspond to a long-lasting experience from the point of view of the being that inhabited it. There was an aspect of Steiner's understanding of the period between incarnations that rarely received the attention it deserved, and that completely transformed the way of understanding what was happening throughout this trajectory, the role of spiritual hierarchies in monitoring the being that had passed through the portal. The human being did not go through the states after death in an isolation analogous to the isolation in which he often found himself during his incarnated life. He was in constant relationship with beings from higher spiritual hierarchies, with entities whose development completely transcended the human, and who accompanied the human being throughout his entire trajectory, both in incarnated life and in the states between incarnations. These beings did not replace the freedom of the human being, nor did they determine what the being would experience in ways that eliminated the being's responsibility for their own actions and developments. But his presence and his accompaniment created the field in which the processes that the investigation described could take place with the precision and adequacy that the development of each being required. The specific circumstances of the retrospective panorama, the specific quality of Kamaloka, the specific possibilities of Devachan, the specific configuration of the conditions that would characterize the next incarnation, all of this emerged from the confluence between what the being had developed and what the spiritual hierarchies that accompanied it contributed to making possible. The question of the relationship between the beings that had passed through the portal and the beings that remained incarnated was another dimension that Steiner had approached with an attention that revealed the importance he saw in this continuity that death did not completely interrupt. Death created a real separation in terms of the conditions of the physical plane. The body that had been the instrument of all communication that depended on the physical senses had ceased to function, and the forms of relationship that depended on that instrument were no longer possible. But the separation was not absolute on the spiritual plane. The beings that had passed through the portal continued to exist on planes that maintained real relationships with the physical plane, even though these relationships operated through means that the majority of incarnated beings had not developed the sensitivity to consciously perceive. What the dead needed from the living was something that had a specificity that was surprising when articulated. They needed the kind of knowledge that only incarnated existence made it possible to develop. The knowledge that emerged precisely from the conditions of limitation and resistance that the physical body and the physical world imposed on the being that inhabited them, the knowledge that was developed precisely through the friction between the aspirations of the spiritual being and the dense conditions of the physical plane. This knowledge could not be developed on the spiritual plane in the same way, because the conditions that made it possible were specific to the physical plane. And when an incarnated being genuinely thought about the dead, when he directed his attention and his love to the being who had passed through the portal with a quality of presence that was real, and not just a projection of the mourner's needs, the thought came to the being on the spiritual plane as something precious, a contact with the specific way of knowing that the incarnate life made possible. Prayer for the dead, which spiritual traditions had preserved as a practice of importance that transcended simply the comfort of the bereaved, had from this perspective a spiritual reality that went far beyond what the secular perspective could recognize. The thought of genuine love directed towards the dead reached the dead on the spiritual plane as a real form of nutrition, of accompaniment, of presence, that the being on the spiritual plane received and used for the development it was undertaking. It was not simply a consolatory gesture that helped the living process their grief. It was a real contribution to the development of the being who had passed through the portal. And the reverse was also real. The dead could offer the living influences that were specific to the perspective that the spiritual plane provided. They could perceive dimensions of the development of the incarnated beings with whom they had relationships that were not available to the incarnated consciousness, limited by the perspective of the habitual ego. They could see possibilities of development that had not yet manifested themselves in external circumstances, and they could direct towards the beings they loved subtle influences that created openings that the development of the incarnates could use, if they were attentive enough to perceive them. Sleep was the point of greatest contact between the worlds. During the hours of sleep, the incarnated human being partially left the physical body and traveled to regions of the spiritual world in which the beings who had passed through the portal inhabited. The encounters that occurred during this nocturnal journey rarely reached daytime consciousness as explicit memories, because the physical body upon awakening did not have the instruments to record what had happened on the planes in which sleep had occurred. But the influences of these encounters manifested themselves in the quality of daytime consciousness in ways that were noticeable, yet rarely attributed to their actual origin. The insights that came in the morning without conscious thought having produced them, the resolutions of emotional knots that had unraveled during the night, the quality of renewal that some awakenings provided regardless of objective circumstances. The perspective that Steiner had elaborated on the death of children and young people, of lives ended before substantial development had been achieved, was one that revealed most clearly how the spiritual understanding of death transformed the meaning of what seemed like a meaningless event. From the perspective of a single incarnated life, premature death was a tragedy that interrupted development before it could produce the fruits it was to produce. From the perspective of the entirety of one's spiritual trajectory, there was something happening that the perspective of a single lifetime could not reach. The brief life had provided the being with exactly what it had to provide at that specific moment in its trajectory, and what had been started but not completed during the brief life would find the conditions for its continuation and development in the subsequent incarnations that the karmic processes in play had to prepare. This did not mean that the pain of premature loss was illegitimate or that it should be suppressed by the spiritual perspective that made it understandable. The pain was real and had to be found as real. What the spiritual perspective modified was not the intensity of the pain, but the quality with which it was inhabited, the presence of a context that prevented the pain from transforming into complete despair, that preserved within the suffering the perception that the being that had passed through the portal continued to exist and develop, and that the relationship with that being had not absolutely ended with the death of the physical body. The issue of preparing for one's own death was one that Steiner addressed in ways that transformed what might seem like a morbid preoccupation into one of the most productive forms of spiritual development during incarnated life. Meditation on death, reflection on what death was and what lay beyond it, the cultivation of a perspective that included death and the understanding of the totality of existence, rather than excluding it as the undesirable end that had to be postponed as long as possible. All of this progressively prepared the quality with which passage through the portal was to be encountered when it arrived. Not because the knowledge about what happened after death eliminated any dimension of what was to be experienced. The retrospective panorama, the Kamaloka, the Devachan, happened according to their own laws, regardless of whether the being had known about them or not during the incarnated life. But the quality of the being that arrived at the portal would have been different if a perspective had developed during incarnated life that included death as an understandable reality instead of an unfathomable abyss before which all understanding ceased. This being arrived at the retrospective panorama with a greater capacity to find what the panorama revealed without collapsing in the face of the revelation. He arrived at Kamaloka with a quality of the contents of the astral body that had to be worked on that was different from the quality that would have been present if the incarnated life had been lived without any reflection on the spiritual consequences of acts and desires. And he arrived at Devachan with a material of experience that would determine the richness of what Devachan provided. The perspective on what happened after Devachan completed the picture in a way that made the title that Steiner had given to the theme understandable, the passage through the portal as a transformation of life. Because after Devachan, the being began the preparation for the next incarnation, the process by which the forces that had been developed and the forces that had remained undeveloped, the karmic patterns that had been created, and those that had to be created by the needs of development, progressively configured the conditions for the next descent to the physical plane. And in this preparation, what had been the previous incarnated life was present as the material from which future development was to emerge, transformed by the journey through the retrospective panorama, through Kamaloka and Devachan, but recognizable as the substratum of all that was to follow. Reincarnation, which Steiner had described with a precision that the traditions that affirmed it had rarely achieved, was not simply the repetition of existence in a series of successive physical bodies. It was the process by which the spiritual being progressively developed, over multiple incarnations, the qualities that spiritual development required, and that no single incarnated life was sufficient to fully develop. Each incarnation had to provide specific conditions that the development of that moment in the trajectory of the being required. Conditions that were configured by the karmic processes that had been created by the previous incarnations, and that the beings of the spiritual hierarchies that accompanied the process helped to prepare with a wisdom that the individual human being could not achieve by himself, neither on the spiritual plane nor on the physical plane. Birth was the portal traveled in the opposite direction. The being who had traveled the entire journey since the death of the previous incarnation, who had crossed the retrospective panorama and Kamaloka and Devachan, and the long preparation for the new incarnation, reached the threshold of birth in the new physical body with the oblivion that the guardian of the threshold would impose as a condition of the freedom with which the new life had to be lived. Without this forgetting, the weight of all the memories of all previous incarnations and of all spiritual existence between incarnations would make impossible the freshness with which each new life was to be encountered. The openness to the possibilities that each new incarnation provided, that was the condition for the development to be genuinely new rather than simply the repetition of what had been. The portal of death and the portal of birth were the same portal crossed in both directions. The same opening between the physical plane and the spiritual plane, crossed in one direction when dying, and in the other when being born, always with the oblivion of what was on the other side that made it possible to fully inhabit the plane on which one had arrived. The being who had inhabited the physical plane and now passed to the spiritual plane progressively forgot the conditions of the physical plane as those of the spiritual plane became the main field of experience. And the being who had inhabited the spiritual plane and who now passed to the physical plane progressively forgot the conditions of the spiritual plane as those of the physical plane, with all their density and all their resistance, became the field in which incarnated existence existed, was about to unfold. Understanding what this implied for everyday life was ultimately what made the teaching about death something more than spiritual curiosity. If what passed through the portal was the being that had been constructed during life, if the retrospective panorama revealed what had been constructed from the perspective that the habitual ego had always avoided, if Kamaloka was to work with what had been developed in the astral body, and Devachan was to provide an existence whose richness depended on what had been spiritually developed, then each moment of incarnated life had an importance that completely transcended any importance that the purely material perspective could attribute to it. Every genuine thought that the human being developed, every relationship that he deepened with a real presence that reached into the being of the other instead of simply using the other for the needs of his own ego, every act that he performed from the best available understanding of what was truly necessary instead of simply what was convenient for the habitual ego, all this was being constructed as the being that the portal was to recognize, as the material that the retrospective panorama was to reveal, as the content that Devachan was to provide as existence. And every moment in which the human being chose superficiality over depth, convenience over truth, habitual ego, satisfaction over what had to be developed so that genuine development could happen, all of this was being constructed equally as the other face of the same being that the portal would recognize with the same relentless clarity with which it recognized what had been genuinely developed. Rudolf Steiner had not designed this perspective to create anxiety about death or to turn life into a grim preparation for the end. I had elaborated because the investigation had revealed that it was what corresponded to reality, and because the understanding of that reality transformed the encounter with each moment of life in a way that the purely material perspective could not produce. The human being who had understood what the portal of death was and what lay beyond it did not live differently because he had to die. He lived differently because he had understood what life was, what was being constructed in each moment of existence, and what had to cross the only border that separated what was ephemeral from what was real. The death gate was the most accurate measure that existed of what life had been. And knowing this measure irrevocably transformed the quality with which the life that had yet to be lived was found. There was a dimension of the teaching about passing through the portal that Steiner had developed with an attention that was inseparable from his understanding of the Golgotha event, and that transformed the perspective on human death in a context that no previous tradition had articulated with the same precision. The event of Golgotha had introduced a transformation into the Earth's spiritual field that had modified the conditions of human existence, both in incarnated life and in the conditions of existence after death. The Solar Logos, who had inhabited the body of Jesus of Nazareth since his baptism in the Jordan, had, when he died on Golgotha, poured into the spiritual field of the earth forces that had permanently transformed the conditions in which any human being who inhabited the earth operated both during life and in the process of death, and in the states that followed. What this meant for the passage through the portal of death was something that Steiner had articulated in different ways in different contexts, but which always had the same core. The conditions in which the human being went through the states after death had been modified by the penetration of Christic forces into the spiritual field of the earth. The possibility of encountering the retrospective panorama with a quality of objectivity that was not simply overwhelming, of working the contents of Kamaloka with a force that emerged from beyond the habitual ego, of experiencing Devachan with a depth that transcended the simply individual. All of this had become more accessible after Golgotha than it had been before, as a consequence of the forces that the Christic event had introduced into the spiritual field that enveloped the earth. The Christ who had said, "I am the resurrection and the life," had expressed with this formulation something that the spiritual perspective made possible to understand in ways that the conventional theological perspective rarely achieved with sufficient precision. The resurrection was not simply the promise that the dead would be resurrected in a future eschatological event, which was the interpretation that tradition had often favored. It was the description of a force that had been introduced into the spiritual field of earth with the event of Golgotha, and which now operated as a real presence in the spiritual constitution of every human being who had incarnated after that event. The force that made it possible for the process of death and rebirth that human evolution carried out over multiple incarnations to be not simply cyclical repetition, but progressive development towards what the human being was destined to become. Death, therefore, as the path of development, not despite being the interruption of incarnated life, but precisely because it was the interruption that allowed what had been developed to be assimilated into the spiritual planes in ways that the continuity of incarnated life did not provide with the same depth. The human being who would die once, and who after death would simply exist eternally in an unchanging state, was, from Steiner's perspective, in a spiritual situation much less favorable to genuine development than the being who would die and reincarnate multiple times, taking to each new incarnation what had been assimilated in the previous ones, and finding in each new incarnation conditions that made possible the development of what had remained undeveloped. The perspective of multiple incarnations was not, for Steiner, simply a doctrine imported from Eastern traditions. It was the result of his spiritual investigation that had revealed that the life of a single being, over the course of a single incarnation, was simply insufficient for the development of what the being was destined to become. And the justice of a cosmos in which beings came into existence with radically different capabilities and conditions was only understandable if there was the possibility that what had been denied or made impossible in one incarnation would find the conditions it needed in future incarnations. There was something about the teaching about the death gate that was especially relevant to contemporary culture, which had developed around death a set of avoidance practices that had a sophistication that made the avoidance almost invisible. Modern medicine had created around its power to postpone death a culture in which it was treated as a failure of the system to be avoided at any cost, rather than as a passage that had to be met with the presence that its meaning deserved. The perspective that spiritual science provided on what happened during the passage through the portal revealed that this culture of avoidance had consequences that went far beyond what a purely medical perspective could recognize. The traditions that had preserved the practice of watching over the body of the deceased for a period before burial, of maintaining a loving presence around the body during the hours and days following death, had intuitively preserved a spiritual reality that spiritual science confirmed. There was a period of accompaniment of the recently deceased being that had real spiritual importance, and that the thoughts and feelings that the living held around the deceased during this period created in the immediate spiritual field a quality of presence that was not indifferent to the process that was taking place. Happening. Grief, as a spiritual process, rather than simply as a psychological process of adapting to loss, was another dimension that Steiner's perspective on death made understandable in ways that the purely psychological perspective did not. The mourner who had understood that the loved one who had passed through the portal continued to exist and develop on planes other than the physical, and that the relationship with that being could continue in ways different from those that had depended on physical presence, was not simply using a consolatory belief to alleviate the pain of loss. It was finding the spiritual reality of what had happened with greater precision than the grief that simply mourned an absolute loss, and it was creating the conditions for a kind of relationship with the dead that was genuine and that benefited both sides of the portal. The peace that dying people who had developed a genuine spiritual perspective often manifested at the moment of death, and which those who accompanied them described as extraordinary even when they were skeptical about the spiritual perspectives that had produced it, was an experiential confirmation that understanding what the portal of death was transformed the quality with which it was encountered. Not the indifference of someone who had convinced themselves that death didn't matter, but the peace of someone who had reached the threshold with enough understanding of what they were going through to meet it with a quality of presence that ignorance about what was happening made it impossible to achieve. The portal of death was, in all the depth and in all the precision of the perspective that Rudolf Steiner had elaborated throughout decades of spiritual investigation, the most fundamental point of all human existence, the point that revealed what life had been in its real spiritual substance, that initiated the transformation of that substance on planes that transcended the physical, and that prepared the conditions for the development that future incarnations would continue. Not an end. Not a catastrophe. A transformation. The transformation of the life that had been into the life that would be, of the being that had reached that point in being that would continue the trajectory that no death had permanently interrupted, but that each death would lead to a level of development that the incarnated life that followed would find as its starting point. The most profound transformation that existed, carried out with a precision and adequacy that spiritual investigation revealed as an expression of the most fundamental laws that governed the development of the cosmos and of the human being who had been called to travel through it.